All right, Isaiah, I've got questions for you about Michigan on behalf of Oregon fans. What has been so wrong with this Michigan passing attack?
Well, it's multiple fold here. It's that's kind of a loaded question in a lot of ways. Obviously, you look at the quarterback, and Davis Warren got to start the first three games, then Alex Orji the next three, and then you had basically one game with Jack Tuttle as the starter. And the turnovers were the biggest issue, I think, overall. But I mean, you've got a mixture of a lot of different things. An unseasoned quarterback that is certainly not really equipped to be able to take charge of a Michigan offense. We'll see if Davis Warren's up to the task now, because obviously he really kind of played a lot better against Michigan State. The pass protection with an all new offensive line, essentially, that's been an issue. There's been injuries on the offensive line. Michigan won a couple games without Miles Hinton. They've been trying to figure out who their best five is. And some of the players that they expected to kind of come in and look really good underperformed, right? Like some of these guys like Giovanni Ohadi and Jeff Percy have had time on task in the last 3 years during that stretch. They've been able to come in and fill in with injuries and looked a lot better than they have so far this year. But I think one of the big things that you can look at against Michigan State, no sacks given up. That's a first again this year. So that's been a big part of it. I think that what's been kind of interesting is just the mentality. 'Cause like you said something in segment one that really kind of struck me, because like you talk about the run game and maybe it's not as good. I think it's been as good, honestly, in a lot of ways. Maybe not as dominant, but the problem for Michigan is from an offensive play calling standpoint, there have been times where it feels like Kurt Campbell has wanted to really just sling the ball around despite it being the limitation. That's why I've long advocated for Alex Orji to retain the starting position, because I understand the second half against USC and the second half against Minnesota didn't look that great. But because Michigan had like kind of the constraints of we need to mostly run the ball, and it looked really good doing so in the first half, they had commanding leads going into the second half in both of those games, right? So, but when they've gone with some of these other quarterbacks, or even Alex Orji at the start of the Washington game, inexplicably they came out trying to pass the ball like right out the gates as if they were a passing first team. And we've seen really two of the three quarterbacks attempt more passes than even JJ McCarthy did on a per game basis last year, when you had a former 5-star who is more well equipped to being able to go out there.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but like that's jarring for me to hear when you are clearly, even if you, no matter how you sliced it before the season, you were downgrading at the quarterback spot because none of those guys are going to be, early first round picks. That's shocking. I think for myself and a lot of Oregon fans to hear that Michigan is not, running the ball 45 times a game and throwing it 10. I mean, JJ McCarthy, didn't he have a game last year where he attempted like 12 passes?
Eight. He was 7 for 8 against
Eight.
Penn State. They realized that they weren't going to be able to pass on Penn State, so they ran 32 straight times in the Penn State game. So that is kind of what they did with Alex Orji in the USC and Minnesota games. And then they go up against Washington, like right out the gates, they're trying to throw the football, and it didn't work out. And Washington went up 14-0, and they made the switch to Jack Tuttle, continued throwing the ball. And ultimately, it was a fumble and a turnover, or an interception, rather, 2 turnovers that changed the calculus of that game. So it is kind of perplexing, because I'd long said exactly what you just said, is Michigan needs to essentially run the ball 40 times and pass it like 10 or 15 times. And with Orji, that's exactly what they were doing. And it kind of doesn't matter if it's Orji or not. The reason why I kind of liked the Alex Orji package, or not package, but him as the starter, was because it kind of forced the hand of Kurt Campbell, the offensive coordinator. Because even when he's called really incredible plays and really creative plays, which he's done every week, I mean, he's had some really boneheaded, questionable play calls from time to time. But there's a lot of times where you look at what he's doing and what he's trying to do, even in the passing game, and you say, that was really smart, and he really schemed a guy open. But the problem is either you had a quarterback who couldn't deliver on that execution, or a wide receiver who, because you have to keep in mind, Michigan also lost its 2 starting wide receivers from last year, in Cornelius Johnson and Roman Wilson. And they did not have anyone with any kind of sizable production going in. They also have been really reticent to use some of the options at their disposal. There have been games where Colston Loveland hasn't been targeted as much as you would expect. Now, most of the time they're going to the well about 7 or 8 times, but there's been a couple games where you've only seen them really go to Colston 4 times or so. Donovan Edwards still not really being utilized in the pass game, despite the fact that we've seen that he can be a really suitable wide receiver type, or at least a pass catching threat out of the backfield. I go back to his freshman year where he had 170 receiving yards against Maryland. But yet, despite them saying going into the next year, 2022, that he was probably the best receiver they had on the entire team, we haven't really seen them try to use him like that. He's underperforming even what he did in terms of receiving each of the last 3 years. So that's kind of been surprising. It just feels like they have options at their disposal that they don't really use. Now, this last week against MSU, they were more creative and used the personnel in a way that more suited what they have. And if that's a kind of a harbinger of what could come this week, then maybe you can throw out the script a little bit and say, okay, maybe we just haven't seen Michigan really going and using what it has the way it should. And now it's figured it out, and now it can move the ball a little bit better. Like I said before, though, just one game isn't really a trend, so it's hard to really see and understand. But against MSU near the end of the first half, when they were down 7-0 and really couldn't move the ball at all, finally you started seeing them putting their players in a position to succeed and executing, and that's how they were able to take a 9-7 halftime lead, go up and make that score 24-10 and be able to hold on. So it'll be interesting to see if they've learned from their mistakes finally, because that's been a big thing. It's been kind of a little bit of everything. It's been a lack of execution. It's been bad coaching. It's been turnovers. It's been new players trying to get acclimated to their roles. And we saw kind of a confluence of that working on the offensive side, but there's still a lot of issues defensively that have allowed teams to stay in it, because for whatever reason, the defense might pitch a gem one game, and then the next game, a team can pass on you. Next game, team can run on you, but they can't pass. Right, because we look at Illinois. Illinois only passed for 80 yards on Michigan, but they were able to run the ball. Early in the year, other teams couldn't really run the ball on Michigan whatsoever, but they could pass. You kind of just don't know what you're going to get on a game-by-game basis from this team.
Like a box of chocolates?
Yeah, pretty much. You never know what you're going to get.
Yeah. I want to ask a question about the defensive side as well, and then we'll flip roles here in the final segment. But as I said earlier, if Michigan's going to hang around or pull the upset here of Oregon with the way they've been playing in the last few weeks, it's got to stay low scoring. I just haven't seen any evidence from Michigan's offense or Oregon's defense that the Wolverines could even get to the 24 to 27 point range with the way Oregon's playing on that side of the ball, whether Jordan Birch is available or not. What is your confidence level, and maybe a key or two to Michigan's defense holding Oregon to their lowest point total of the year? I think they'd have to keep them around 20.
I don't necessarily have a high confidence level, right? Like I would predict Oregon to basically match the spread at least 14.5, I believe it is at this point on FanDuel. Yep. But it's at the same time, it's kind of more like, okay, that's more of a coaching thing than it is a personnel thing. I mean, they do have some personnel issues. Zeke Berry, the nickelback, has regressed significantly. Is Will Johnson able to go? Because Zamir Hall is obviously a big downgrade from Will Johnson, can take away a whole side of the field. Will Johnson's the all-time Michigan leader in pick sixes as well. He's got 2 on the season so far. So if he's able to go, then that can kind of change things. I mean, we've seen Dylan Gabriel have some moments where he's made some errant throws. It's rare, but it's happened. Obviously, we've seen him turn the ball over. So that's kind of what Michigan needs, is to be able to capitalize on those things. And it's going to just take a lot of these guys that have played good games playing their best game. Really, that's usually what you see in any big matchup, right? It's usually not going to be like, well, they didn't play their best game and they still won. I mean, that does happen. Oregon didn't play its best game against Ohio State and it still won. Felt like there was a lot of meat left on the bone in that matchup. But for a team like Michigan, that's to be able to upend Oregon in this game, it's going to require some of these guys that have shown that they can be really good. Jair Hill, who's had his moments of looking really good, but looked really, really bad in the first several games of the season. You look at the Texas game, Texas was targeting him directly. But by the time that USC came to town, he suddenly was a much better player, but then he regressed against Washington. So it's going to take the defense kind of playing up to its strengths. And part of it is the linebacking core, which has really surprised me with how not good it's been. Ernest Hausman was the top linebacker in the portal a couple of years ago. He had to sit behind Junior Colson and Mike Barrett last year, and you expected him to be kind of an All-American type, and he's been okay, but he hasn't been a disaster. But it's been kind of shocking at how kind of reactive he's been. But even more so, Jay Sean Barham, the transfer from Maryland, they spoke about him as being a guy that they thought internally was going to be a first-round draft pick, and he's been mostly abysmal this year. He's had some moments, but he's been out of position. It's kind of one of those things where he's so freakishly athletic that he runs himself out of plays. He hasn't shown very good instincts a lot of the time this year. So that's been a real big problem for them in terms of defense. And then you look at the safety position, it's been kind of the same. You go into the season, the safeties were my top position for the entire team. It was just looking so deep, even with Rod Moore being out for the majority of the season after tearing his ACL in the spring game. You look at Makari Page, who's been a starter the last 3 years. You look at Quentin Johnson, who was a pivotal role player for Michigan. I mean, Quentin's been very good. Makari's regressed significantly. And then they brought in Jaden Mangum, who we haven't seen outside of game one, and Wesley Walker, who got burned a few times against MSU. It's gotten to be a very thin group, and it hasn't really played up to its potential. So if Michigan defensively, it's got guys who have performed at a high level. You look at some of these names I said, they've played incredible in the Rose Bowl and against Washington in the national championship game. But then in some of these games, they've regressed. And they're running the system that they've run. The last two defensive coordinators for Michigan were acolytes of Wink Martindale under him at the Baltimore Ravens. But Wink comes in, not really acclimated to the college game, kind of doing some things that might work in the NFL. The cue of, hey, I've got to humble myself a little bit and understand that some of these things aren't going to work in the college game because it is a different style of game. So he hasn't necessarily called the greatest games. Some of the personnel groupings that they've had have been questionable at best. So it's going to take also some introspection from Wink Martindale to take a look at what he has, say, this is the best way we can beat Oregon. And if this doesn't work, we need to go back to the types of things that have worked with this personnel grouping in the past.